Welcome back to Coffeesodes. This is your quick shot of knowledge, episode number 46. I'm Josh, and with me today is Kelly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly.
We're diving into some seriously mind-bending research that suggests economics might actually be governed by the laws of physics. And we're not just talking about simple stuff like supply and demand. We're going deep into the realm of thermodynamics, exploring the idea that the economy is fundamentally driven by something called entropy. You can find more details about the research itself in the episode description. But just imagine for a second, what if your personal wealth and even your happiness could be explained, at least in part, by the same forces that govern the movement of stars and the behavior of atoms? That's what we're going to unpack today.
It all starts with a fascinating concept called the Entropy Theory of Value, or ETV. Now, we usually think about value in terms of dollars and cents, but ETV says the real value of anything, a product, a service, even an idea, is the amount of energy it took to create and bring it to market.
So instead of dollars or euros, we're talking about joules, like we learned back in physics class.
Right. Exactly. And this actually connects to a much older economic idea called the labor theory of value. Remember, work is essentially energy. When you lift a weight, you're using energy, and that energy can be measured in joules. So when we apply that to economics, it means the value of something is directly related to the amount of work or energy that went into it.
Okay, that makes sense. So, for example, gold is valuable because it takes a ton of energy to mine it, refine it, and turn it into those shiny bars we see in bank vaults.
Right, precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting when we think about things like fiat currency, the dollars, euros, and yen that we use every day. Because in terms of actual energy, fiat currency is basically worthless. It only has value because we, as a society, agree that it does. But what happens when that agreement breaks down? What happens when people lose faith in the system?
That's a great question. We see it all the time.
Right.
Inflation, market crashes. Those are signs that the trust in our fiat currency is getting shaky. But how does this all connect to entropy? You keep mentioning that. And I have to admit, it's a bit of a head-scratcher.
Think of it this way. Entropy is all about disorder and chaos. It's the natural tendency for things to move from order to disorder over time. Think about a room that you clean. It starts out neat and tidy, but eventually it gets messy again. That's entropy at work. And the second law of thermodynamics says that in any closed system, entropy will always increase.
Okay, so how does that apply to the economy? Is the economy a closed system?
Well, it's not perfectly closed, but the paper argues that, in essence. The entire economy is a giant entropy machine. We're constantly using energy to create things, to produce goods and services. And in the process, we're generating more and more disorder. Even something as simple as making a cup of coffee involves converting energy into entropy.
Hold on. So my morning coffee is contributing to the cosmic chaos.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Every action we take, every transaction in the economy is contributing to the overall increase in entropy. And the paper argues that the most successful organisms, and by extension, the most successful economic systems, are the ones that are best at converting energy into entropy efficiently.
So the more complex an organism or a system is, the more entropy it generates.
That's the basic idea. And this is where the comparison between different economic systems gets really interesting, because the paper argues that capitalism, with its focus on individual gain and constant growth, might actually be the most natural fit for this law of maximum entropy production.
So you're saying that capitalism, with all its flaws and complexities, might actually be the most efficient way to generate entropy. That's a pretty bold claim. So we've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
From the energy theory of value to the idea that the economy is basically a giant entropy machine. Where do we go from here?
Well, now that we have this new framework for understanding how the economy works, let's dive into the heart of the matter. How does this entropy lens change our understanding of different economic systems like capitalism and communism? And more importantly, what does it mean for our future?
Sounds like we're about to get into the really juicy stuff.
It's a real paradigm shift, isn't it? Makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about money and value.
Big time. You mentioned this idea of maximum entropy production and how capitalism might actually be the most natural fit for that. But isn't the goal of a good economy to create some level of order and stability? How do we reconcile those two seemingly opposing ideas?
That's a great question, and it's something the paper addresses directly. It argues that while we might strive for order and stability, the underlying forces of the universe, as described by the laws of thermodynamics, are constantly pushing things towards disorder. So any attempt to impose too much control on the economy will inevitably face resistance from this fundamental tendency.
So it's like trying to swim upstream against a powerful current.
Exactly. And it's not just about abstract concepts like order and disorder. The paper provides concrete examples of how this plays out in real-world economic policies. Take price caps, for instance. Governments often impose price caps on essential goods to make them more affordable for people, especially during times of crisis.
Yeah, that makes sense. When prices are sky high, it seems like a good thing to step in and make sure people can afford basic necessities.
On the surface, yes, but the paper argues that price caps, while well-intentioned, can actually lead to unintended consequences that harm the very people they're meant to help.
How so? I'm not an economist, so break it down for me.
Sure, if you artificially lower the price of something below its market value, producers have less incentive to produce it because they're not making as much profit. This can lead to shortages as demand outstrips supply.
So basically, by trying to make things more affordable, you end up with less of that thing available.
Precisely. And then you might see things like rationing, black markets, or even hoarding, unintended consequences that create more problems than they solve.
Wow. So even well-meaning attempts to intervene in the market can backfire. It's like the economy is this delicate ecosystem that we need to be careful not to disrupt.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of understanding the underlying principles at play. The paper is basically saying that we can't ignore the laws of thermodynamics when it comes to economics. We need to work with them, not against them.
Okay, I get that we need to be mindful of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But does that mean we should just let the free market run wild and do whatever it wants?
The paper isn't advocating for complete laissez-faire economics. It's more about recognizing the limitations of our attempts to control complex systems. It's a call for humility, for understanding that we don't have all the answers. And that sometimes the best approach is to let the system self-regulate to some extent.
It's like we're trying to micromanage this giant chaotic dance floor when we should just let people find their own groove.
I like that. It's about respecting the inherent tendencies of the system while still trying to achieve certain social goals. Instead of trying to force specific outcomes, maybe we should focus on creating the conditions for a more resilient and adaptable economy, one that can better cope with the inevitable chaos and fluctuations. It means that instead of trying to fight against entropy, we can learn to work with it, to harness its power for good.
Okay, but what does that actually look like in practice? How do we move from this theoretical understanding of entropy to concrete policies and actions that can create a more sustainable and equitable world?
That's a question we'll explore further after the break. We'll delve into how this entropy lens might change our approach to issues like environmental policy, social justice, and even our understanding of personal happiness and well-being.
All right, listeners, we're going to take a quick pause to refuel those coffee cups. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Coffeesodes. We're in the final stretch of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey, and I have to admit, it's really shifted my perspective on how the world works.
We've gone from thinking about value in terms of dollars and cents to understanding it as energy, and we've explored how the natural tendency towards disorder, or entropy, might actually be the driving force behind economic systems.
And we've talked about how attempts to control or regulate the economy can sometimes backfire because they're going against this fundamental principle of entropy. But now I'm curious, what does all of this mean for some of the big challenges we're facing today, like climate change, social inequality, and the pursuit of happiness? Can we really address these issues if we're constantly battling against this invisible force of entropy?
Those are great questions. And they're exactly what the researchers delve into in the latter part of the paper. They argue that this entropy lens can actually offer valuable insights into how we approach these challenges.
So instead of seeing entropy as the enemy, we can learn to work with it.
Exactly. Remember, entropy isn't inherently good or bad. It's simply a fundamental law of nature. The key is understanding how it operates and how we can harness its power for positive change.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. How does this apply to something like environmental sustainability?
Let's think about our current approach to reducing carbon emissions. We often focus on restricting or regulating certain industries, imposing limits on pollution, and trying to control energy consumption.
Which seems like a logical approach.
But the paper argues that these top-down approaches might not be the most effective in the long run, because they're essentially trying to impose order on a system that naturally tends towards disorder. And as we've discussed, that can create unintended consequences and even lead to resistance.
So, what's the alternative? Are you saying we should just give up and let entropy run wild?
Not at all. Think about renewable energy. Instead of just subsidizing solar panels or wind turbines, what if we invested in research and development to create more efficient and adaptable energy systems? Systems that can harness energy from a variety of sources, that can store energy more effectively, and that can adjust to fluctuations in supply and demand.
So it's about creating a more diverse and flexible energy ecosystem, kind of like a natural ecosystem that can adapt to changing conditions.
Exactly. The same principle applies to other areas as well. For example, instead of trying to control population growth through restrictive policies, what if we focused on empowering women through education and economic opportunities? This would not only lead to greater gender equality, but could also naturally lead to lower birth rates and a more sustainable population in the long run.
So it's about finding solutions that work with the flow of entropy rather than against it.
Precisely.
This is a powerful idea. It's almost like we've been trying to fight the tide when we could be learning to surf.
I love that analogy. And it's not just about large-scale systems. This principle can also apply to our individual lives.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about our pursuit of happiness. We often strive for a state of perfect order and control in our lives. We try to eliminate all sources of stress and uncertainty. But the reality is that life is inherently messy and unpredictable.
Tell me about it.
Right. So, instead of trying to create a perfectly ordered existence, what if we learn to embrace the chaos, the unexpected twists and turns, as opportunities for growth and learning? What if we focused on building resilience, adaptability, and a sense of humor in the face of life's inevitable entropy?
So instead of fearing entropy, we should embrace it.
Exactly, because within that chaos and uncertainty lies the potential for creativity, innovation, and even joy. It's about recognizing that entropy is not the enemy. It's simply a fundamental part of the universe we live in.
Wow. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. I feel like we've gone on a journey from the subatomic world of physics to the grand sweep of human history and back again to our own personal lives.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what's the key takeaway here for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
I think the most important message is that we don't have to be victims of entropy. We can learn to understand it, work with it, and even harness its power for positive change.
And that change can happen at every level, from our individual choices to our societal systems. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and maybe even shifted your perspective a bit. We'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. And until next time, keep those coffee cups full and those minds open.